It is along the Atlantic seaboard that the English would colonize, and this is where we turn our attention. We'll see that the first colonies were actually in the Chesapeake. We often think about the Pilgrims and New England, but in truth, the first colonies were Virginia. Then we turn our attention to New England. After that, the Middle Atlantic colonies, and then the later colonies in the South. What you see there is a map of Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was called New England at the time. You see down at the bottom of the map, Cape Cod. So this map is actually, the top of the map is west, the bottom of the map is east, left is south, and right is north. And you see there Massachusetts Bay, and eventually places where towns such as Boston, Andover, Portsmouth, and of course, Salem would all be founded. Unlike the French, the English were certainly not willing to open their prisons and put the dregs of their society into the colonies. Nonetheless, English colonial policy did favor the poor that were crowding into the cities to get out of there to grant relief to the urban centers that were growing in England. It also became a place where political factions could find shelter away from the problems that reigned in England. And of course, then you had religious factions, Protestant versus Catholic. You'll see that there will be colonies that are based on the Protestant model, there will be colonies that are based on the Catholic model, and then there'll be colonies that are a little bit more tolerant, shall we say. Now, when it came to political factions, one must understand the English Civil War. You see there the picture of King Charles I of the House of Stuart. He was both King of England and Scotland. He is one of the last true absolute monarchs of England, and for that, he would eventually be deposed, put on trial by Parliament and Oliver Cromwell, and then have his head cut off as a threat to the state. The supporters of Charles I in the English Civil War were called the Royalists or the Cavaliers, and many of them would flee England during the period of the Protectorate under the rule of Cromwell. Eventually, however, Cromwell would die. His son Richard would last only 1 year as ruler of England, and he would eventually be removed, and you would have the restoration of Charles I's son, Charles II of England. This was an era of decadence, but it was a time in which those who were, shall we say, in favor of Cromwell, that is, the Puritan factions in England, would then find themselves now needing a place to go. Eventually, in 1688, Charles I's other son, that is Charles II's brother, James, the Duke of York, after whom the city of New York is named, would eventually become King of England. And he would be so over the top Catholic that eventually Parliament had enough of him and forced him out in what was known as the Glorious Revolution in England, because there was no true violence in England. They decided to do the violence to the Irish over in Ireland. And again, this led to political and religious factions leaving England. Now, as you would recall, Sir Walter Raleigh founded the Virginia colony along the coast of the Chesapeake. And then when they returned 3 years later, they found that the colony had disappeared. This is a mock-up or a recreation of what one of the early colonial dwellings would have looked like under Raleigh's early Virginia colony that did not survive. But some 20 or so years later, they would return to Virginia. They created a company. Much of the colonization of the Americas, whether it be from the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, or the British, were done by companies rather than directly by the crown, almost like chartered corporations. The Virginia Company now established itself to create a colony on Raleigh's model and in Raleigh's place. And thus you have the settlement of Virginia under Jamestown in 1607. Now, the main goal of the colonists was to find gold. Unfortunately, there is no gold along the Atlantic seaboard. The place where Jamestown was located between the James and the York Rivers, was an unhealthy, miasmic, swampy site. It also was already inhabited by a tribal confederacy called the Powhatans. The colony was floundering, and again it looked like it might disappear just as Sir Walter Raleigh's colony would disappear until Captain John Smith arrived. John Smith was a very capable man, but he was very acerbic and arrogant, and in some ways he had to be. One of the first things he did is he told the colonists, start digging. That is, start working the land and seeing what crop you can come up with. And if you don't work, you don't eat. Then he turned and he negotiated with the Powhatans. Now, the negotiation with the Powhatans involved him actually submitting himself to a ritual form of execution that did not actually take his life, at which point a young maiden from the Powhatan Confederacy named Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief, would then ceremonially plea for his life. And this would then establish John Smith as almost a vassal of the Powhatan Confederacy. Now, of course, John Smith did not marry Pocahontas. Pocahontas married another Virginian and then moved to England. The colony begins to grow, but it grows slowly. They finally found a crop that would grow in the swampy soil, thanks to the Powhatans, who gave them both food and the understanding of what would grow. Tobacco. Tobacco. Then, in order to solve the problem of labor, because tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop, in 1618, they established the headright system. This was a means to solve the labor shortage. That is, colonists already residing in Virginia were granted 2 headrights, which are 50 acres of land each. That's 100 acres, obviously. If you were a new settler and paid your own passage to Virginia, you were granted 1 headright. Since every person who entered the colony received a headright, families were encouraged to migrate together. The larger the family, the larger the land. Wealthy individuals could accumulate headrights by paying for the passage of poor individuals. Most of the workers who entered Virginia under this arrangement came, therefore, as indentured servants. That is, they paid for their transportation by pledging to perform 5 to 7 years of labor for the landowner. This allowed businessmen to amass large plots of land by importing workers. And this is how the aristocracy of Virginia is created. Plantation owners were further enriched by receiving headrights for newly imported slaves in 1619, which was when it began. This is how Virginia succeeded. Land ownership gave many people a reason to work hard, with the assurance that they were working for their own future, not that of the company, because once they finished their indenture, they were given land, they were also given tools and tobacco seeds, and they were also provided materials to build their own shelters and buildings. So you see there, the building that hosted the very first meeting of the planter aristocracy in Virginia that begin to call themselves burgesses, which is a sort of a takeoff on the German word burger. And this is the first representative body of government in the Atlantic colonies and in North America. This is an etching depicting the almost execution of Captain John Smith, and then the plea for his life, in which he would pledge his friendship to the Powhatan Confederacy. And it was a long-lasting friendship between Powhatan and Virginia that would go all the way into the American Civil War. Virginia was a Protestant colony founded and establishing the Church of England there. After the Reformation in England, Roman Catholics were considered to be alien, foreign, and undesired. They were badly oppressed, especially in the wake of the English Civil War, when the Puritans, who certainly did not like the Roman Catholic Church, were ruling England. To this effect, eventually, George and Cecil Calvert, the first and second Lords Baltimore, who were Roman Catholics themselves, begin to settle a colony that they call Maryland. They name it after the Queen, who is the wife of King Charles. However, Catholics do not go to Maryland in large numbers. Instead, Protestants do. And in Maryland, they have an uneasy existence with the Indians. Now, Calvert, knowing that he has a Protestant majority, passes a Toleration Act. This act is rejected by Cromwell. Maryland then begins to pass anti-Catholic legislation. Well, after Cromwell dies and Charles II returns to the throne, Maryland is returned to the Calverts, and they then become virulently anti-Protestant. And so you begin to see in the colonies a very strong antipathy toward the Roman Catholic Church, and from the Roman Catholic Church toward Protestants. Roman Catholics are considered almost one step away from the devil for many of these folks. There are other problems in the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia. First of all, tobacco is a terrible crop. It's a terrible crop because of the product itself, but it also exhausts the soil. Because it is so labor intensive, tobacco inhibited social development. People who would have had more time planting wheat or other cash crops that were less labor intensive are spending all of their time either working tobacco or talking tobacco. And so they don't really develop much of a culture at first. Because it's labor intensive, there's a labor shortage. And because most of the indentured servants are men, it leaves a ratio of 3 to 1 in favor of men. And when you have 3 times as many men as you have women, you have plenty of frustrated men. This is one of the reasons why African labor rises, because you could not enslave the Indians. The Powhatans would never have allowed that. So when the Dutch trader lands accidentally in Jamestown in 1619, this is when African labor now begins to move the economy away from indentured servitude. And this map simply shows the Maryland and Virginia colonies. You notice that there's no noticeable western border of the Virginia colony because Virginia felt like it went all the way to the Appalachian Mountains and then beyond. Virginia is the oldest of the colonies. Now, you see the location of Jamestown on the map. You see where the Powhatan and the Pamunkey and the Nanticoke, Lenape, Kanoi, Tuscarora, Pamlico, and Tutello Indian tribes lived and interacted with the Virginia colonists. Now we turn to New England. And of course, when we think of New England, we think of 2 groups, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Pilgrims were a Protestant separatist group around the village of Scrooby in England. They were led by William Bradford. James I, King James, of the King James Bible fame, forced out the Pilgrims because they were so far to the extreme as far as their separatism. At first, they fled to the Netherlands. However, they did not like the Netherlands too much because their children were growing up speaking Dutch and learning Dutch customs, and they felt themselves to be English. So, of course, they leave for North America on the ship called the Mayflower, which we're all very familiar with. And they arrived at Cape Cod, Plymouth Rock in 1620. And there they had the first true document of governmental authority that was actually signed on the Mayflower, called the Mayflower Compact. And this established the Plymouth colony. And of course, you know the story quite well, at least as far as even back in first and second grade. social studies classes. They had a very harsh first winter and then reached out to Somerset and Squanto and the Wampanoag Indians and signed the Massasoit Treaty. And there they established their colony and held the first Thanksgiving feast that we've all learned and heard about and so forth. Cut from a very different bolt of cloth were the Puritans. The Pilgrims were separatists, and so were the Puritans. However, the Pilgrims just wanted to have their own colony and be left alone. The Puritans, on the other hand, were more prosperous than the poorer Pilgrims, and they had a much bigger sense of themselves. They believed that they were doing something great. In fact, when they left England to create their own colony, they called it the Great Migration. There was only 630 people in the Great Migration. That doesn't exactly make it great, but they call it that nonetheless because they had a sense that what they were doing was very important. Blessed by God. They were led by John Winthrop. They land in Massachusetts Bay and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there they begin to set up their government and their society. And their government and society were based on what was known as closed corporate communities. Towns like Dedham, Salem, Andover, Boston, and so on. A closed corporate community is very hierarchical, it's very male dominated. It is dominated by the Protestant work ethic. It's closed, therefore, there is little religious toleration. No, there's hardly any religious toleration other than the Puritan religion, which is a strict Calvinistic, what we would call Presbyterian religion today. Strict Calvinism, very doom gloom religion. It is a doom gloom religion because it believed that basically humanity was destined for hell and it was predetermined, you were predestined, predestination, and that the only way that you could maybe get your way into the good graces of the Almighty was to throw yourself on His mercy and live a very, very dour lifestyle. This way, you would expel people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams would go on and help create Connecticut and Rhode Island. These corporate communities were considered to be perfect. They were trying to perfect themselves in the eyes of God. They were trying to make a covenant, a perfect covenant with God. The problem is that once you establish your colony, you now begin to be fruitful and multiply. Your colony gets larger, and your children tend to be, shall we say, a little bit more rambunctious than you, and they begin to, in their own sort of way, rebel against this covenant. So what do? They only go part of the way on the covenant. And so the communities begin to spread out, they begin to change, and we call this declension. That is, the decline of the community's ethic and model from what it originally was to what it's becoming. It's not to say that the community's in decline. As a matter of fact, it's increasing in economy, it's increasing in population and organization. It is simply declining in the amount of religious fervor that it has. Now, let's understand each other. They still have tremendous religious fervor there, and we're going to see the dark side of that religious fervor very soon. Unlike the Pilgrims, who got along very well with the Wampanoag Indians, the Puritans did not get along well with their neighbors. The Puritans were always trying to get more land because they're growing, they're multiplying, they need more land for their children, for their families. And most of the time, you would negotiate for it. However, at times they would simply take land. And Indians felt that they were being treated very poorly. They had opened their arms out to them and had welcomed them in and had even adopted the religion. And then, what do? They have their land stolen from them and they're being pushed out. Enter one Matacomet, who is known as King Philip. He initiates the Pequot War. and the Indians rebel. Now, Metacomet is eventually defeated, murdered, and then beheaded. However, things happen as a result of this. Number one, the towns, the Puritan towns that fought King Philip's War and the Pequot War, which are really the same thing, used their young people to do it. And so they give the young people the job of going to war, the teenagers and the young 20-year-olds, and they tell them, go to war. And they go to war. And war is a terrible thing. And people experiencing tough things in war, people are transformed by it. Then they come back, and the Puritans are like, okay, thanks for the service. Now get back to work and do what you were supposed to do beforehand. Some of these young people rebelled. In fact, in one town, they destroyed the meeting house as a form of protest. Why? Because that's just how soldiers are when they come back from war. You need to appreciate them. All this time, Massachusetts is changing. I've already spoken about the halfway covenant, as the children of the Puritans, instead of going all the way on the covenant, go halfway on the covenant. Eventually, they get to be so rambunctious that Charles II revokes the charter in 1683 and renames the Massachusetts Bay Colony the Dominion of New England. And Massachusetts reverts to the crown and becomes a royal colony, which means that the king appoints the governor and the king has the right, the last word on everything that's going on in there. Massachusetts also now begins to grant suffrage to free males of property. So you're beginning to see the right to vote to be increased from a small elite group to a larger group. Now it's still males, and of course it's still white males, but it's expanding. Now here is a map of Salem Village as it was in 1692, with its property all divided up among the people of the village. Understand, there's a difference between Salem town, which the blue arrow points to, which is the small little town with the port facilities and so forth, and the village, which is further out in the wilderness. Today, we would call this town, instead of Salem Village, we call it Danvers, Massachusetts, which is still there. But understand that this is the place where the greatest form of religious and political hysteria will ever take place in North America. Let's understand something. The Salem witch trials occupy quite a place in the American collective consciousness. So why did it happen? What went on here? Well, first of all, you got to understand, if you look at the people in the picture there, the young children in the picture, these were weird people. There's no other way to say it. The Puritans were a strange group of people. They did not celebrate Christmas. They found that to be much too Roman Catholicism for them, much too celebratory. Christmas was kind of a drunken festival back in those days. It was German, and that was much too raucous. These people were strong Calvinists, and they have a very doom and gloom look at the world. So the witch trials that take place from 1692 to 1693 centered on Salem Village, but it did happen in other places as well. It's a combination of mass hysteria, but at its base is politics. Now, what do I mean by that? The Salem witch trials began when one family, the Putnam family, which had been running Salem for quite a long time, suddenly found themselves no longer running Salem Village anymore, and it was the Porter family that got reelected. And when any group of people, and keep this in mind, any group of people who have been holding power for a long time and believe that it is their right to hold power, suddenly are not holding power anymore, they begin to think that they're entitled to return to power, or that something wrong in the world has taken place. That's the first thing. So it's a political squabble between the Porter and the Putnam people. Two, they're hugging the Atlantic seaboard. There's plenty of wilderness to the west. And the wilderness was dark. The wilderness was chaos, savage. That's where the devil lurked. And these people already believed that the devil lurked behind every shrubbery, every shadow behind every rock. And thus, when a slave woman named Tituba begins to influence 4 young girls in such a way that they begin to do some foolish things, the genie's let out of the bottle, so to speak. Now, much of this is directed animus toward women of property and nonconformists. They are the ones that have ruined our closed corporate community. They are the ones that are the work of the devil. These girls that had seizures, so to speak, where'd they come from? Well, people have postulated that it's medical reasons. Maybe they ate the wrong thing. Maybe there was a lack of vitamins in their diet. We don't know. What we do know is that 30 people were put on trial and found guilty, and 19 of them were executed by hanging. 14 women and 5 men. Giles Corey would never, ever give a plea. He would not argue in his defense. He died under torture after refusing to enter his plea, and they tortured him to death by putting a block of wood or a plank of wood on him and then dropping rocks on it until it squeezed him to death. 5 other people died in jails waiting for their trial. Finally, the hysteria died down. In 1702, the trials were declared unlawful. In 1711, the colonial legislature annulled the convictions. It took another 300 years for the town of Salem, when it was celebrating, or commemorating, I should say, the 300th anniversary in 1992, to formally issue an apology. What happens in the aftermath of this witch hunt and witch trials? A lot of people said that, okay, we were wrong. But we were wrong for the right reasons. We need to rededicate ourselves to the Almighty. We need to find a new way of exploring religion. And so, in many ways, without the Salem witch trials, you're not going to have what's later called the Great Awakening, which is, of course, the movie that you have to watch for extra credit in this class. This is what an early Puritan household would look like. Again, very bare bones, not a whole lot of decor on this. This is a very dour community. This is called the Ship Church, located right outside of Boston. The ship church was built to look like you were actually still in the ship. They never forgot the fact that they were migrants, that they had come from another place. And while Puritan churches were notoriously unadorned, there is a certain elegance about this. And of course, the pulpit was the center of this particular church. The map now shows the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut, Rhode Island, the Plymouth Colony, the establishment of the New Haven, Connecticut. Remember that Connecticut was an area for dissenters from the closed corporate communities. This would eventually be called the Dominion of New England. More tolerant and less restrictive was the Middle Atlantic region. But of course, it was also less organized and less, shall we say, efficient. The Middle Atlantic region of the colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Now, eventually, New Amsterdam would fall to the English. A series of wars between the English and the Dutch over a period of 12 years, between 1652 and 1664, would result in the English taking over New Amsterdam and naming it after James, the Duke of York, the brother of Charles II, who would later become King James II. New York was heavily taxed because, after all, the English are the overlords, the Dutch are the now subjects, so you tax the living hell out of them. There's no legislative assembly. There's a very heavy patronage system, but the establishment of a diverse colony remains. And New York becomes a place for diversity, as it remains so today. Eventually, the folks in New York would get tired of the heavy-handedness of the English, and so Timothy Leisler led a group that rebelled against the English. Now, Leisler's rebellion was foiled, and it failed, and he was executed. But the English is so totally English. The solution proves worse than the problem. In executing these men and publicly, it created martyrs out of them. And so eventually the English said, all right, that's fine. We'll create the New York Assembly. Now, New Jersey was very similar to New York in social and political makeup, and it was basically sort of a sloughing off colony for New York colonists. So it's very similar in its social and political makeup. New Jersey is one of two colonies, however, that does not claim territory across the Appalachians, the other being Delaware. In examining Pennsylvania, one has to remember that the religious foundation of Pennsylvania is a group that calls themselves the Society of Friends. We call them the Quakers. Quakers were people that lived in England. They were a separatist group too. They lived in northwestern England close to Wales and sometimes over the border of Wales. They were pacifists, nonconformists, did not adhere to any set clerical doctrines, so to speak. They believed that their souls were in commune with each other when they went to meeting rather than church. You don't go to church as a Quaker, you go to meeting. And for this and for their strangeness, they were pretty much run out of England. And so one of the leading Quakers, William Penn, was granted a charter in 1651 to establish a colony that would be run by his family. This is not a corporation running it, and this is not the crown running it. This is a proprietary colony. Penn wanted to make sure that he would establish a colony that tolerance was the key word. It was an egalitarian society. It allowed open debate. It allowed universal male suffrage. Of course, that meant white male suffrage, but that is still quite progressive for the time. Liberal land policies. Anybody who wanted could get land from the Penn family. And to do that, he worked out a very good deal with both the Lenape Indians and the Delaware Indians. This would be a multicultural society. It would be open to fugitives and exiles, particular among which were a group of the Anabaptist sect that came out of Germany. They had been massacred in towns like Munster and other places. They're called Anabaptists because they believed in a second baptism, that baptism had to be adult. And they were massacred in their towns oftentimes by saying, oh, you want a second baptism? Then they tie them with rocks and throw them into the water. Many people call them the Pennsylvania Dutch because they spoke German, Deutsch, but they weren't Dutch. They were actually Germans. We call them the Amish. And the Amish would establish their communities and would adhere to their traditions and customs to this very day. Penn also built the city of Philadelphia, which means the city of brotherly love. The city of Rocky, right? The city of the Philadelphia Eagles fans. Hardly brotherly love, but that's what the name means. And it was designed to reflect the welcoming egalitarian society that Pennsylvania had. To have universal male suffrage, white male suffrage, was incredibly big and would mark Pennsylvania as one of the most liberal of all the colonies. And again, you see the area of settlement of these colonies. You notice that New York is somewhat restricted in its westward movement, although it does claim that land to the west and also across the Appalachians. But the Iroquois Confederation is standing in their way, and they are a very well organized confederation. You also see, of course, West Jersey, and we'll put one other Atlantic colony in there, Delaware. Not much of a colony, but it is established. The last region of the country we look at is the South, where South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia are located. South Carolina was established by yeoman farmers. A yeoman farmer is an individual farmer with a small plot of land. He works it himself, sometimes with a slave or two, but not a whole lot. I'm not trying to diminish the problem. I'm just simply saying they were not large slave owners. Many of these folks were settlers from the island of Barbados, which is a very lucrative sugar producing island in the West Indies, and they brought with them their slaves. They established their city and named it after King Charles, Charlestown, South Carolina, which later gets shortened to Charleston. They have an economy based on deer skins, the selling of slaves, trading of slaves, pine timber in the northern part of the colony, sugar. Of course, these are Barbadians that come down. Cattle, but the real wealth of South Carolina is on the islands where it is marshy. And there you cultivate rice. Rice is an incredibly lucrative crop, as opposed to tobacco, which could fluctuate with the market. Rice was a very steady and wealthy crop. North Carolina, which comes along a little later than South Carolina, throws off its proprietors and begins to develop as basically a combination of Virginia farmers and indentured servants. It's really more an expansion of Virginia than it is of South Carolina. It is especially well known for its pine tar and its lumber. If the Puritans were strange, James Oglethorpe was beyond belief. In 1732, he establishes the colony of Georgia, which he names Georgia because King George II, who is the grandfather of George III, is sitting on the throne. Essentially, this colony was established as a buffer against the Spanish. The life of the early colonists in Georgia was interesting, complex, tough. There was military conscription of all males. There was no representative assembly. Oglethorpe ran it himself. There was no large land grants, no alcohol, and no slaves allowed. This meant that Georgia was pretty much not much of a colony until South Carolinians began moving across the Savannah River into Georgia. And basically, Oglethorpe says, I've had enough of this, and only 18 years after taking control gives it back to the crown in 1750, and Georgia begins to shall we say, organize even more. But Georgia is one of the last colonies to enter the Union in 1787, only because it is so unorganized from the very get-go. What you see here in this map are the colonies, but also their claims over the Appalachian. Notice the large claim of Virginia, the Ohio River Valley, the claims of North Carolina, Georgia, which eventually will become Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama. And you see where Georgia is part of the Creek Nation, one of the 5 civilized tribes, and it's established essentially to be a buffer against Spanish Florida.